Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. As we continue the pursuit of excellence in clinical trials, today I'm joined by my colleagues, Elicia Dellinger and Brandy Chittester. Elicia and Brandy are going to discuss site selection in clinical trials. Welcome to the chat, Elicia and Brandy.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, as a primer, just in my opinion, considerations towards site selection revolve around identifying sites with the necessary infrastructure, resources, experienced staff, and obviously the appropriate target patient population to support the successful conduct of the trial. Now, Elicia and Brandy can tell me how I am wrong, and they will delve into the nuances. So ladies, can you please briefly describe the process of selecting the appropriate sites for clinical trials?
So here at 𝗧𝗵𝗶𝘀, we start the site selection process with a list of sites. Sometimes the sponsors might have a list of sites that they have already initiated contact with or are interested in and want to use. We also try to consider some sites that we have worked with previously, since we already have that relationship built with them. Additionally, we might gather some sites from clinicaltrials.gov or any other resources that we might find sites that have the same therapeutic area that the study is targeting. Once we have that site list narrowed down, then we would start the process of making initial contact with the sites. Usually I would send out an interest email just trying to see if there's doctors or physicians there that are interested in the study. Then we would move on to getting a confidentiality disclosure agreement executed. And then we would send out a feasibility questionnaire. The feasibility questionnaire is a series of questions that we would ask about site staff, their capabilities, have they worked with these types of studies before? We would ask some specific questions about equipment, space. Once we receive that from the site, we would kind of have an internal meeting, kind of go through their questionnaires, and then we would move forward with doing a site assessment visit. After we do the site assessment visit, we would pretty much discuss whether we would choose the site for the study.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. So we kind of start like cast a wide net, and then we try to bring it in so that once we select the sites, we choose the best ones for each study. Because just because there's a good relationship with the client or from us from one study, it might just not be the right time. There might be competing trials, or there might be some turnover changes at the site we need to be aware of. So it's really important that we really look at each site to make sure they're the right fit. And there are times where we can skip a couple steps if we have previous relationships, or if we've worked with the sites before, and maybe we're working on, like a follow-on type study or same client. So there's always exceptions to every rule, but we would want to make sure that the documentation for that trial is really clear on its own to show why these sites were qualified for the study. So
excellent. Really appreciate all that detail. So what factors influence site selection for trials? Now, do these factors vary depending on the type of study? Say, for example, do they vary for first-in-human studies or pilots or even pivotal studies?
So I think Brandy and I have discussed this before. I think it depends on the therapeutic area and the device that the study has that's involved. But one of the things we would look at is the time and speed. Some universities, bigger academic centers, take a lot longer to get up. Some of your smaller clinics take a little bit shorter. So we would look at those metrics. And we also have our CTMS system, which is the clinical trial management system. We're able to kind of go back at sites that we worked with previously, kind of look at their timelines, were they kind of taken too long, were they on target, how long did it take for us to get the reg docs and their budget executed. So that's one of the factors. Another factor I think would be location, where are these sites located. Some sponsors prefer to have sites kind of all over. So that would be one of the factors in choosing a site.
Yep. Those are really good thoughts, and so sometimes having those previous experiences doesn't mean maybe a slower timeline than anticipated, or maybe less enrollment than anticipated. Doesn't mean the site gets ruled out, but it might mean we know what those roadblocks might be and where we can provide a little extra support, or how we can help the site get through it, because sometimes you're working with a different team too, depending on how it works. If I can tie back to another discussion you've had, Jay, talking
Please.
about those first in human studies and the strategy, like choosing the sites that have the right mindset for the type of trial we're working on is of course critical. So we talked about like PIs who have the flexibility for a few first in human study, but you need the rigidity in a, say, for example, an IDE study where we have the strict protocol to follow, and the eligibility criteria are fixed, and the way we use the product is fixed. So definitely will change how we look for sites depending on where we are in this process of approval.
Excellent. I'm so glad you're letting your experience shine through, because these are key points, and I'm sure you could take each one of these sub points to think of and expand on it in a 3-hour session.
Sure. We won't do that today, though.
Maybe some other day. But yeah, let's move on. So help us understand, what's the expected interaction between a trial sponsor, otherwise manufacturer, right, and a clinical trial site? And where could manufacturers or sponsors with no prior trial experience or trial execution experience go wrong in this regard?
So I'll start first. I started my clinical research career, at the site level as a coordinator. And I think I felt more pressure when the sponsor was in contact with me. It was kind of like over communicating from the CRO and the sponsor. But there were times when I would hear from them, and they would provide some positive feedback. It'd be a little bit of encouragement, motivated me a little bit more for the study. So I think there just has to be a good balance between the communication from the sponsor to the site. So I think that's important. You don't want to overstep the CRO that's managing the study, but you also want to make sure that the sites know that you are noticing their work, their hard work throughout the study.
Yeah, it's such a good point of the balance of communication. And we work really hard to make sure that we know from the outset who's going to communicate about what pieces, so that we do keep it streamlined. But I think there's sometimes it's helpful to think about the fact, the manufacturers or sponsors are sometimes thinking about their future customers, which is of course important, and we really recognize that relationship, but we're looking at good trial sites as well. So finding the key investigators is very important, especially with a novel technology or a very complex product. But we also want to make sure the whole infrastructure is there. So we can come behind a sponsor who's found, some really good investigators to work with, and then wrap up the other pieces. How is their site staff? And then going back to the timelines, and what kind of support will they need to get approvals, and what kind of IRB can they use? And then, of course, our role will be to wrap up all that documentation, so it's really clear later, how did we choose these sites? And it's, digging in a little bit more beyond just the capabilities technically for using the product, but then also following the patients through all their follow-up and getting good data in and all of those kinds of things. Excellent
points, especially from a pragmatic perspective, right? Because what do we always hear? We hear communicate more. And here we have, the two of you have been there and done it. And you're saying, don't overburden the sites, don't over-communicate. Role clarity is important, right? Yeah. So that's a very, very important takeaway. Thank you, ladies. Last question, unless we want to keep going, but last question that I have in mind for now. Very often, trials fail due to inadequate enrollment. I've heard that so much, both in industry and in my time as a regulator. Very often, people think that proper site selection is the whole and sole factor for site performance and a successful clinical study. Well, I think while site selection is important, it's not the sole decider for study success. I suspect you'd agree. So, any thoughts on how one can mitigate this risk from a site selection perspective?
Yeah. So I think if we kind of go back to what we were talking about before, it is really looking holistically at the sites and what their infrastructure is, and also,
Mm-hmm.
what other studies are they juggling, and are there any competing
Uh-huh.
trials? So we really want to make sure, especially when we're thinking about enrollment, and when we also usually want to know, like, how many of these types of procedures do you typically do, and how often are you seeing these kinds of patients? But we have to remember the protocol is going to have, some eligibility criteria that might screen out a lot of those patients. And then, there's other studies that are happening at the site. So we're really kind of, I think there's like a rule of thumb out there that divide by 3 or something sometimes when you think of what we
I've heard
might be
that.
able to do and then what we can do.
Yeah.
And it's a hard estimate to make, but
Right.
we really do want to spend that time up front choosing sites based on a lot of factors. But of course, then as the study goes on, we also have to think about things that can happen that might, potentially derail. And it's, of course, not intentional, but maybe there's some turnover, and then we have to
Mm.
work on getting some new people ramped up. Or maybe
Mm-hmm.
the surgeon that we chose went to another site. Do we follow that surgeon? Do we find another one? And maybe, so there's like always a lot of maybes that can happen in the middle of the study. Maybe we have to have a pretty significant protocol amendment,
Mm-hmm.
and then it maybe changes the kinds of patients we can get in the study for one reason or another. So site selection can't be the point of blame for all of the enrollment woes, but certainly
Right.
good site selection will help us if we can get off on the right foot.
That reminds me of an experience that I've had in my previous role. There were manufacturers, and this was multiple instances of the same, so that's the reason I'm bringing it up here. There were a couple of manufacturers, in fact, more than a couple, that were conducting post-market studies, okay? And these were intended to be single center, single site studies. And for each one of them, unfortunately, the PIs happened to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And it just put a huge wrench in the works.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
if you're pursuing single center studies, something to really bear in mind, maybe think about backups
Sure.
and how to activate them effectively and keep them motivated and all of that, right? Anyway, okay. Well, I've enjoyed learning about site selection from both Elicia and Brandy. I hope you too have. But in the meanwhile, Elicia and Brandy, thank you for helping us attain a better understanding of what it takes to select sites effectively, and the RQM best practices and the 𝗧𝗵𝗶𝘀+'s approach, I should say, to help us achieve site selection efficiently. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.